our lived experience, which unfortunately includes infant death and subsequent mental health struggles, please take good care of yourself and only listen if this content feels safe for you right now. We'll still be here when you're ready.
Hi, I'm Judith.
And I'm Alina. We are internet friends turned real-life friends who both experienced the tragic loss of our sons to sudden infant death syndrome in winter of 2021.
In the year after Aiden died, my husband and I both became unemployed. My parents divorced, and we had to move 5 times for various reasons.
And as for me, just a few weeks before my son Quinn died, my then husband had come out to me as a transgender woman, and we're subsequently divorcing.
It's been a lot.
It's been a lot.
But as long as we're living, we will love our sons deeply and work to make sure that we live a life that makes them proud.
Welcome to As Long As I'm Living podcast.
We're so glad you're here. Hi, everyone. I'm Judith, and I'm Aiden's mom.
I'm Alina, and I'm Quinn's mom.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mandel, and I'm also a lost mom.
So I'm going to give Dr. Mandel a formal introduction that she sent me earlier today. But I'm also going to say something personal because, full disclosure, Dr. Mandel is my therapist. So we've spent many hours together. And even though I'm happy to talk about your decades of experience, I think a personal introduction would be more fitting for the relationship that we have. But first, I'm going to read what you sent me because it sounds very official. Okay, ready? Dr. Mandel is a clinical psychologist who's been in private practice for decades. I don't like this introduction. It's very formal.
Okay, you change it.
Can I just say my own thing?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, she works with individuals, couples, families. She's done groups. I know you do groups of people who've lost children. So you've done all sorts of therapy, but honestly, I just don't think that can do you justice. I'll tell you the story that I told Alina about why I am so excited to have Dr. Mandel here. And I think that she just gives a really unique perspective as to what the work in therapy can do to help process loss. When Aiden died, he died on the 4th, and the first time you and I spoke was on the 10th, so that was 6 days later. And I remember you called me right after, like before we had our appointment set up, you called me, and I just kept asking over and over and over and over again. I just kept saying, are you going to help me? Are you going to help me? How can you help me? You can help me? I need help. Who's going to help me? And I just remember you were so kind and so gracious on the other end, and you're like, I promise I'm going to help. I'm going to help. And you said, if I can do it, you can do it. If I can do it, you can do this. You just said it over and over and over again. And I think that was the first time a lost mom had said, basically, I'm going to pave the path for you. And you don't have to do this alone because I know how to get out of this hole and I'm going to work through it. And as someone who is just like in the throes of grief and I couldn't even breathe and the weight on my chest was so heavy. It felt so good to have somebody kind of hold my hand and say, I'm going to do this with you. So anyway, I'm excited to get into things with Dr. Mandel. Now, Alina, you don't know Dr. Mandel personally, but you know all about her. And Dr. Mandel, you don't know Alina personally, but you know all about her.
That's right. I know all about Dr. Mandel. I hear all the time, well, Dr. Mandel said this, and, I'm going to talk to Dr. Mandel about that. And I think I need to schedule an extra appointment with Dr. Mandel this week. And I'll even say, you know what, Judith, I think you should call Dr. Mandel. I think this, you really need an extra session.
This is on my pay grade.
And my ears weren't even burning when that happened.
That's true. So Dr. Mandel, let's start. You've had decades of experience dealing with all sorts of people's problems, but I guess you said in the last 18 years, you've done special work with people who've lost children after the experience with your loss. But how would you say that grief therapy is different than normal?
We need someone to witness the magnitude of this pain and be with us in it. I say that I'm holding it with you so you don't have to bear it alone. Grieving is a terribly lonely process, actually, even when we have good relationships and many loved ones. It's helpful to have a place to explore thoughts, feelings, behaviors, even spiritual dilemmas that arise in the course of mourning. There are specific tasks in mourning that may or may not apply to other kinds of therapy. Things like having to accept the reality of the loss when we're in total shock, to identify and express feelings, to learn how to live in the environment without our loved one physically present, to learn how to hold our child in a non-physical space but still be in relationship to them. Figure out how to know ourselves again in a barren landscape that we don't even recognize. And I just want to say, even though I did not lose a child to SIDS, sudden death, whether it's SIDS or another kind of sudden death, is even most difficult to grieve because there's such a sense of unreality. And it's so much more complicated because you had no time to prepare.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard. I think what you said about the unreality is so true because, I mean, nothing's easy, right? No type of grief is easy. No loss is easy, but there is like a certain amount of, there's a period of time right after it happens where you literally like the earth, it doesn't even seem real. You know, you're looking at the sky and you're like, how is the sky blue? Like nothing makes sense anymore. And so there's that whole chunk of time. You have to kind of get through that before you can even start doing any work at all and accept the loss into your life before you can even really begin to process, right?
Correct. And there's all these complications like feeling guilty, maybe a desire to blame. Maybe there's medical and legal authorities that are involved, and that's an extra layer that we have to deal with. There's a tremendous sense of helplessness and a huge need to understand because our brains are not comprehending what has happened. And so we are struggling to make sense of something that doesn't seem like it could possibly make sense.
So how can we begin to accept the kind of unacceptable loss of a child? Like what are the first steps?
Well, my first answer is bit by bit. Because in the beginning, there's this idea that we have to go 1 second, 1 moment, 1 breath at a time because it feels so intolerable. So the first steps are very, very small. If we can eat, if we can drink, if we can sleep, and sometimes we can't, if we can be in the room with another person, or if we can survive them not being in the room with us, moment by moment. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that we're biologically wired for attachment, particularly with our child. We're supposed to care, nurture, and protect our child. So in the beginning, we can't even process that attachment that we are supposed to be in the midst of is no longer physically present. So there are all these looping questions. How can this be? We replay details and events. We try to search for a different outcome. People loop and loop as if they think it's through one last time, somehow the ending will be different. It takes a long time, and we start with an intellectual acceptance or recognition. I won't even say acceptance, I'll say recognition. But the emotional part takes longer because the goal of our attachment to other human beings is to maintain those bonds of affection. And so death is so stark, we can't maintain it anymore. So it's as if we have to learn how to live all over again.
So wait, let me ask you a question. So someone will come to you, in my case, me, I came to you, and I remember replaying things over and over and over in my head. And I remember you specifically said that to me, what you just said about how you're just looking for if I missed one thing, maybe things would turn out different. So how do you, by just talking through things, help the person or, help the griever get out of that loop? Like, I guess what I don't understand, I know what you and I do together and I know it works, but I don't really understand how or why it works. Like, I know I feel better after, but I don't understand why I feel better.
So it's really a complex process. Part of it is I am sitting and holding a reality with you, and you are slowly exploring the difference between what the reality was before and what it is now. So it's like this dawning awakening of, okay, so this is real. This isn't changing. How do I understand this? We sit in that together. And one of the things, Judith, you may remember this, is I say, I'm going to hold this with you because it's too big for you to hold.
Yeah.
Right. And what happens, and this over time, what happens is that we're living in that shock, but the business of living is going on around us. And whether in the beginning, it's just moments of, okay, I eat, I drink, I have a conversation with somebody, I go to the store and I buy something, we start to live. And that gets integrated with the part of us that can't make sense of anything. And over the course of days and weeks and months, we have longer and longer period of time where we're living normally. We're doing tasks of life. And so we start to connect the mourning with actual living that is happening in the wake of our loss. And we become strengthened in, okay, somehow I can proceed. It can still feel emotionally absolutely unacceptable that we've had this loss, and truly it is unacceptable. But somehow we begin to know ourselves as still moving forward and still handling life. And then we start to feel stronger and we start to gain a sense of ourselves again. because we don't even know how to be ourselves initially, but we learn that day by day as we see ourselves handling things.
I feel like for me, kind of like what you're saying really rings true, because it felt like in the beginning, it consumed everything. Literally every cell of my body was screaming for a creature that no longer existed. Every minute of the day was spent thinking about it. And then there would be snippets here and there where I was able to kind of almost shut down and forget it, and then maybe eat a piece of toast, shut down and forget it and go for a walk. And then, the learning of being able to still hold it and feel it and also go for a walk.
Exactly.
I go to work. I've integrated it to the point where I can, feel really sad for a few minutes while I'm on a walk and then just kind of just keep going. It's like and then of course there are still times where it comes me, but those times are fewer and further.
I wonder if maybe the long-term, I don't know, long-term goal is the right word, but maybe the long-term goal is to be able to say, I live my life normally, I fully am integrated into the world and this loss is integrated in me, but now I have extra energy to give of that love that I had for my child to other people, and like a way to pay it forward. It's almost like in the beginning, it just all consumes you. Then you learn to integrate it with your life. And it's like you have to hold both. And then eventually that love no longer sucks the energy out of you. It gives you energy to give forth and give back to the world.
I think that's beautifully said. And that connects to something that's fundamentally true about me, which is that I have and had a huge need to make something good out of the most horrific thing. And I was a therapist before this and I helped with grieving before this, but now it's a passion to make something good, and helping grieving parents is that making good for me, because I know it from the inside out. Yeah. And so it's not just something I read in a book. I know that people can survive this and also thrive.
Yeah. I remember before I met you, like there was that 6 days. And in that 6 days, I had a meeting with the therapist that I had been seeing before Aiden died. And the first thing she said to me was, she's like, I know that, you don't know what to say right now, but we don't have to talk about the loss. We can talk about how the loss affected other things. She's like, we could talk about your family. Like, we don't have to talk about the loss. And I wanted to stare at her, because I think that's a perfect example of someone who doesn't get it. Like, don't you understand? My entire world is the loss. How could I possibly talk about something that is not the loss? When I think when you start working in grief therapy, for me, the difference is it doesn't really matter who you were or what you were before the loss, because that person is gone. Yeah. So it's kind of like you have to start with the loss and then rebuild who you are, as opposed to when you normally go to therapy and people are like, tell me about your parents, tell me what the rules were in your house growing up. Like, that is completely irrelevant. All of that is like a joke. All the rules are changed. How you relate with your family, how you relate with your friends, how you relate with your spouse. It's a completely new world. So you need someone to walk you through every relationship, every scenario, because it looks different than it did.
Exactly right. And a big portion of that for me is I greet somebody where they are, because some people need to just cry in my presence and they can't even formulate the words yet. And some people need to actually try to put the feelings away briefly and be cognitive. And some, everybody needs something different. And one of the things that I do is I normalize the grieving process. I educate people about how grieving goes. People are so self-critical, so fearful. They get so many incorrect messages from other people about what grieving should look like. There isn't a timeline for grieving, and everybody grieves differently. And so I just join somebody on their path and help them move forward. Another thing about how people come to therapy is that some people, like you, Judith, need to be reassured that they'll be okay. Other people are actually the opposite. They want to know that it's okay not to be okay. And so to be reassured that they'll be okay is actually an affront to them. What do you mean I'm going to be okay? I can't possibly be okay. That's unacceptable. I would judge myself for that. So that's back to the idea of greet people where they are, and everybody needs different things.
Yeah. I know for me, the idea of being okay in the beginning was actually really traumatic, because I didn't want being okay in the beginning felt like, oh, I've forgotten about him. Like there was a part of me that really wanted to hold on to the pain, and I've been able to since let that go. But I've heard from other lost parents that is also very common, right?
Absolutely. And that's also connected to a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame, a lot of self-judgment, as opposed to, and this is part of the education that I was talking about, is all feelings are acceptable. Sadness, anger, blame, remorse, confusion, anxiety, depression, all feelings are natural. And so really the journey of grief therapy is just navigating them and understanding them, not judging them, because the premise is true for grief therapy. That's true for all therapy, is that what we resist persists, meaning that if we put energy in going away from something, it stays there or it gets magnified. The only way to do the work is through. You can't go around it. You can't go above it.
I want to ask a quick question about that, because you hit on something that I think a lot of people deal with, is there are kind of two conflicting messages, which is everything is okay in grief, but then we also know that there are some coping mechanisms that are not healthy, drinking excessively, eating excessively. So it's like, where is the line between this is what I need to do to get through the day and I'm turning to an unhealthy coping mechanism?
It's a really wonderful question. And part of the answer is what you just said, unhealthy. Because if what we're doing to cope actually takes away from our quality of life or our sense of well-being or our sense of self-care, it's not going to be the best idea. So one of the things that I do initially is I find out what support system people have. I find out what their coping strategies are. I find out what soothes them. And we just create building blocks, and hopefully they're healthy ones. Now, if somebody takes a drink sometimes, is that the end of the world? Of course not. But we ideally want to help people be healthy and take care of themselves, because that's going to facilitate the grief process. And we also don't want to contribute to somebody being upset with themselves, disappointed in themselves, with self-recrimination for behavior that they're ashamed of, because that's just adding insult to injury.
One of the things that you do that I appreciate the most is when I'll come to you and I'll say, specifically with the baby that I just had, I'll say, I can't sleep at night. I'm so afraid. And you say, well, of course you are. I'll be like, what should I do? I'm so scared. And you're like, of course you're scared. I think you really normalize some of the things that I don't know. I've never grieved before. I don't know what's normal, what's not. But for someone to say, what would be I can't think of a better reaction to trauma than being anxious. Like, of course you're going to be anxious, to just really normalize that. And Alina and I even say to each other, which I think is really one of the things that you've taught me, is like, why am I crying? Why am I so upset? And I'll say, because your baby died. That's like a normal reaction. Like, of course you're going to be sad and upset. I think that one of the things you said about just like normalizing and sitting in the feelings that you have without judgment, that's one of the things I've learned to do probably the most. Just sitting there and being sad, or just sitting there and saying, okay, I'm anxious because my baby died. That makes sense, or I'm whatever it is, whatever feeling I'm having, it makes sense because I've been through a lot of trauma. And I don't think I knew how to do that before. Alina, did you?
No, I did not know how to do that before. I wanted to fix all the feelings, fix the bad ones, get them out.
Yeah. So I love to normalize, because what I know is that many people are not taught about feelings. Lots of people grow up in loving households, but they're not taught how to be okay with their internal emotional world. And so it's a huge education, not only the grieving itself, but just how to be with self. And everybody has difficult feelings, and we have mixed feelings. And so I think human beings have a desire to feel one thing or another. And it's simpler for our brains to comprehend, I feel this thing. But most often we have mixed feelings. I love my new baby, and I also miss my son.
Miss Aiden. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't know how to feel both of those things at the same time. Am I doing something wrong that I'm feeling two things at the same time? No, you're being perfectly normal, perfectly human. Of course you do.
I mean, these, as I'm getting further out from the loss, and little snippets of joy here and there. And there's even in my happiest moments, I still think I would give this all up to have him back. And that's hard, because that makes it so that it's hard to surrender to happiness and joy in the present when there's a piece of me that's like, I would give this all up, but I would, and I'm happy. Those are both true.
Right. Exactly right, Alina.
Yeah.
And this actually gets to another point, which is part of the task of grieving is to make meaning. And one thing that is so beautiful about this podcast is the two of you are doing something meaningful out of something terrible. You're helping so many people by sharing your stories. And that's how we move forward. We make life meaningful. And we can do it for ourselves. We can do it in honor of the child that we lost. We can do it because life is fuller when we do that. And sitting here in agony, it's not a tribute to anybody to do that.
I remember when Aiden first died, I kept asking, like, when do I like do the project? You know, like, when do I like start the foundation, or like, when am I supposed to like walk my 5K? You know, like I think so often we see all these incredible organizations or like named opera houses after people who passed. So you just assume like I need to start a Aiden box and help, I don't know, Sid's parents get more diapers or whatever it is that we think we're supposed to do, because that's what we see. But we're seeing like the end. We're not seeing like the first 10 billion chapters, you know, the work that goes into the place. And I kind of feel like one of the things that I learned is that it kind of comes, I never thought I would start a podcast, and I never thought a podcast would help people. And I never thought this is how I would continue the relationship with Aiden. But I think that once I've been doing the work and I've been in a place where I had something to give, like I only can give until I had something to give, right?
We couldn't have started a podcast in like, a couple months after the loss, right?
Exactly.
And I think we could have walked to 5K, and I don't know if it would have been meaningful.
Right.
I don't know if we would have been ready.
Correct. And I think another important thing to say is that when people are able to make a foundation or do something big, that's wonderful. That's incredible. But lots of people don't want to or can't, but that doesn't mean that there isn't meaning, because here's an example. One of my favorite things is one way to honor your child or any loved one that's lost on a birthday or an anniversary. Okay, do a random act of kindness with my child in mind. And there's a ripple effect that happens. So even if it's not a banner, a billboard, a building, if we create good in this universe, if we pay it forward in some beautiful, thoughtful, kind way, the world is a better place for it.
I have a question that I would love to ask you, and feel free to take as long as you want to answer. Also, you can feel free to decline to answer, because this is a sensitive topic, and I understand if you wouldn't want to. But we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the bad feelings. I wonder if you could share a professional perspective on, after your child dies, that the difference between wanting to be dead, thinking you might die, and then when you actually maybe would need to seek help. Because I do think those are different. And again, please feel free to say this is too much for a podcast. But I do know Judith and I have spoken a lot about, there were times we wanted to be dead. There were times we thought we might die, but neither of us, felt suicidal. And I do know that my family has sometimes expressed concern, and it felt ridiculous to me, because I was like, I'm not suicidal. Like, I was like, yes, I want to be dead, but I'm not suicidal, And I think that there's misconception, is that those are the same.
Alina, I think this is actually an excellent question. People are in trouble when they have suicidal ideation along with a plan and a means to carry out that plan. And also particularly if that's accompanied by sort of an obsessive focus on that plan. If they don't have other coping mechanisms, also if they don't have support, or if they don't want to get better and they pretty much at all times don't want to be here. I mean, there are other circumstances where people take their lives, but what I want to say is it is normal to have feelings that are so overwhelming in the wake of losing your child that you think you will die from them. And the truth is, no one dies from feelings, but it feels like that because the feelings are so enormous. It's as if it's pouring out of our pores and we don't know how to breathe or live with those feelings. I can't imagine losing your child and not feeling that. Back to normalizing. Okay. In the beginning, certainly, and for a time to not be able to envision how to walk forward in life without your child here. I also think that's normal. Just to have the thought, I don't want to be living in this life without my child. Also normal. But that's not co-equal with I'm going to kill myself.
Right.
And it takes time to figure out how to live without their physical presence. But that doesn't mean you're suicidal.
We'll insert in the description some links to some support networks if in fact anybody really is feeling concerned about this, because this is obviously a very serious topic. But I appreciate your distinction on that, because I do think there is a distinction for sure.
Yes. And also it's important to know, is there a history of suicide attempts? Is there prior instability that where people are very emotionally fragile and they don't have coping strategies that support them? Right. It's going to be a lot more difficult when something cataclysmic like this happens.
I remember thinking to myself, this was about as bad as it got for me. And I'm sharing this to hopefully, if anybody maybe can commiserate, but I just remember if I got hit by a truck, that would be kind of convenient. I'm laughing because it's like literally like that was the extent of it. I was like, gosh, wouldn't that be convenient if I didn't have to do this anymore? Because it's so bad. It's so bad in the beginning, especially.
I can't tell you, I hope you won't be offended for me to tell you that so many people dealing with grief say that same thing.
Yeah, I'm not offended at all. It feels great.
Right, because we don't want to harm ourselves. We don't want to take the action, but it would make the feeling stop.
It would be awfully convenient. Someone actually said to me, they're like, well, you didn't have other living children. They're like, I'm only alive because I have 3 living children that need me. So they're like, what kept you alive? Why did you keep doing it? I feel that's a fair question.
And what's your answer?
I said, I just had hope that things had to get better.
I think that most people have an incredibly strong life force. And this is actually where spirituality comes in. And we haven't touched on that, or religion yet. And we don't need to go into specifics. But I think that people's beliefs about what we're doing here not only is important in our lives, but becomes really paramount at a time like this. And I will say that grieving goes differently for people who have a belief in spirituality or some kind of meaning, as opposed to the people who say there is no meaning, it's all random, and then we die and it's all over. And of course, there's a whole range of what people believe in this universe, and everybody's truth is their own truth, power to them. But I will just say, when we find, back to that idea of meaning, when we hold an idea of some kind of rhythm to the universe, it's helpful. And also, sometimes, this is not true for everybody, but sometimes it's helpful when we think that our child would not want us to suffer, that the loss of them is tragic enough. Compiling another tragic loss of the parent on top of that, that's not a win.
I'm going to try to remember to link in the description. Judith and I had a conversation on this podcast. We called it Crisis of Faith, but it's basically talking about spirituality and how our feelings on it have changed since the loss, because I know mine have certainly.
Can you share with our community here what we can do on the hard days? You know, let's say we know like a Mother's Day is coming up or a holiday. Like, how do you teach people to deal with the hard days?
It's a combination of things. Okay, the first thing is to actually, in no order of importance, make sure that your support system is lined up in the way that you want them to be. And sometimes that's somebody's checking on us, but they're respecting that we want to be alone. And sometimes it's planning an activity, and sometimes it isn't planning an activity. Sometimes it's doing, like for an older child, sometimes people will go to their favorite restaurant or do their favorite activity, or they will paint a rock and put it at their gravesite, or they will put a note in the bottle and put it in the ocean. There's a million things to do, but there's the question of, do I want to do something intentionally? Do I want to focus on self-care? Do I want to just communicate with somebody? Do I want to talk about my child? What will make the most sense to me? What will matter to me? What will soothe me? Doesn't matter what it is. I will say that anticipation is very often more difficult than the day itself. And I think that's one thing that's really important to be aware of, because we sometimes set ourselves up in this frenzy of, I've got to do it well. I've got to make it perfect. I've got to honor the person in the exact right way. And we stress ourselves out. But if we're taking care of ourselves and we're keeping our loved one in mind, whatever way, shape, or form that comes to us, it's all good.
Judith and I took very different approaches to our son's birthdays. We've talked about this in the podcast before. Judith threw a whole party with the whole family, baked a cake, did a whole thing. And for me, I literally sat in my apartment and thought about him all day and did nothing. That was it. And they could not be more different. And we both had positive birthday experience.
And we both agree that the anticipation was worse than the day itself.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
times 100%.
Yeah.
So important to know that.
One of the other questions that I feel like you and I have spoken about a lot is how to deal with family dynamics, because everyone is so different with their family. But I think when you experience a loss that's so tragic, it kind of affects everyone so differently. So how can people deal with their family? Like, what should you do? I just brought my entire family to see you, is what I did.
And I love that,
I just
by
let
the
you
way.
do the work, and I just shut up for it. But
Judith referred to it as, Dr. Mandel translated grief into English and English into grief for my family.
That's what she did. That's what she did. But like, what can people do? Because I think everybody has shit with their family after loss.
So knowing when to ask for help is a great place to start. But also, I think knowing your truth, everything ripples out of that. If your truth is you need space, you speak that truth. If your truth is to say, I need to ask you to do something differently, then that's your truth and you ask for that. I think a lot of it depends on what the existing family system is and how proficient or non-proficient people are emotionally and also in dealing with difficult feelings like grief. So sometimes it's communicating to them, I need you to actually just sit with me and not fix anything, right? For other people, it's, I need you to take care of me. Can you please do this thing for me? So it really depends a lot on what the circumstances are. So for some people, the ask is very difficult. But for other people, it's not that they have trouble asking, it's that they don't get the response that they want. And so how do they deal with having a doubly broken heart? Because even though they know their family loves them, it's not translating in a way that's useful to them. So they have to figure out how to deal with the disappointment and loneliness and isolation of a loving family who don't know, they just can't get it right for you.
Tell them about the milk at the hardware store.
Okay. So if you need something from a family member and you feel like you've asked in every possible way to get that thing and they don't show up with it, but you keep asking and you think, I've got to ask differently and I've got to do it better and I've got to modulate my tone and I've got to ask in the morning instead of the evening. Sometimes what I'll say is, if you go to the hardware store and you ask for milk, they're going to look at you and they're going to say, lady, we don't sell milk. But if you go to the hardware store and you say, but I need you to have milk. This milk is really important to me. I'm going to have a problem if you don't have this milk. I'm really going to bang on your door until you have the milk. They're going to look at you and say, I'm really, really sorry. I feel bad for you, but we don't sell milk. So you asking differently is not going to give you milk in our hardware store. So I talk about recognize when you're asking for milk at the hardware store and don't beat your head against the wall. But you have to really know when that's the situation because there are family members who are more malleable and flexible. And if we do examine our approach and we do figure out who they are and what they need and how we best get our needs met with them, there will be milk at that hardware store. And so part of the work in therapy is just figuring out what your system is, figuring out where you're getting in your own pothole and you are not working effectively to get your needs met.
What compelling case can we make to the people around us that need therapy desperately, but whether it be because they don't believe in it or because of the stigma around it, they're not interested in going?
That's kind of a complicated answer because it really depends on the person. For one person, they will have an idea in their minds that therapy is not for them. But if the person who is in therapy invites the person who isn't in therapy into a therapy session and says, will you come for me? Sometimes there's a buy-in that they get that it's not scary, it's not threatening, and they become more open. What's difficult is when somebody isn't going to shift and you really have a need for them to be different and they're not going to be different or they're going to do it in their own way in their own time. Because it sometimes feels like a great conflict to stay in attachment to that person when that person's resistance means that we have a lot of needs that aren't going to be met. Mm-hmm. And so I think we do our best to lead with empathy. I love this person. I know they're not trying to harm me. They're taking care of themselves in the best way they can. And yet I'm going to get those emotional needs or those supportive needs met somewhere else where there's milk at that hardware store.
And what happens if, let's say, you must see sometimes clients that come in that had the loss 5 years ago and they never dealt with it. Like, how does it manifest? Alina and I went to therapy right away, but if I didn't go to therapy, how would it have affected me by not coping with it immediately? Like 5 years later, how does it play out?
So It can be in one or many areas of functioning. It can be in terms of thoughts, like thoughts are disordered and confused. It can be in terms of feelings, like I have tremendous sadness. I can't get out of bed. I'm depressed. I am not sure if it's from my loss. I don't know where it came from, but there's this idea of something emotionally is awry. It can be behavioral. I realize that I'm overeating. I'm taking drugs, like something behaviorally, or I'm not functioning well at work. I'm not dealing with the tasks of daily living. Any of our systems, our social system, I'm not seeing people. I'm isolating. I feel like I hide from people. Any aspect of our functioning that goes awry can be a sign that something is wrong and there's need for intervention, or that we can just be assisted in examining what's happening.
I think that was really well put. I think that we all can think of someone in our life who maybe should be in therapy and isn't.
So there are some people who are not going to be interested in therapy no matter what you do or say. But what I tend to say to people is there's no downside to self-discovery, right? It's a great benefit to have someone who's safe and trusted in a private, personal, protected space to help you look deeply into yourself and help you feel better or have your life move more freely in directions you want it to. So the difference between a therapist and somebody else is that the therapist is someone who is there just for you and has no other agenda. They don't need anything from you. They don't want you to shift in any particular way other than for your best well-being. And so if someone can come to see that a lot of their fear is either something that's come from the outside historically, somebody gave them a message that self-examination is negative or scary, or they are being hard on themselves, and so to look deeply will bring up a lot of self-judgment, they're going to resist if they have those feelings, but none of that exists in the therapy space. It is all acceptance, support, with a desire for understanding.
And I think, what I would say as my call to action, I guess, is I am still desperately sad, but I'm suffering less now than I was before. And I think therapy can help. It can't take away pain, but I do think it can lessen the suffering. And why not? As you mentioned, like, why not try it, right? If it could help with the suffering, why not try it?
Exactly right. Do you relate to the idea of someone is there for you, holding it with you?
Yes.
Does that feel true for you?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And there's something healing in that, right?
Absolutely.
Because I think in our society, first of all, I think it's so horrific that most people don't want to see it. They don't want to look at how big it is and how scary it is and how horrible it is. And so it's like there are so few people that can help you carry it because everyone else is afraid of it. And just having someone, including that therapist that I saw before you, who was like, we don't have to talk about it. What she was telling me is I can't look at this big, ugly, horrible thing. It's too scary for me to even talk to you about. And so you just feel so alone. But having somebody say, like, your big, scary, ugly thing in your life isn't that big, scary, and ugly to me, and I'm going to help you carry it. It just feels so much better. It just feels so much lighter. The load is lighter when you're sharing it with someone.
Exactly right. I think I have the most blessed job to be able to have people share their innermost selves and trust.
You love your job.
I love my job. I feel like it is the most interesting work possible, that everybody is interesting. Everybody has a story to be told. Everybody can grow. Everybody can change and improve in ways that they wish to. To be able to have a safe place for people to explore themselves and grow and change and manifest who and what they want to be in this world, it's the most amazing thing. And so to start with somebody who's in so much pain they don't know how to be and have them return to their lives, obviously forever changed, but still return and figure out how to live again, it's the most wonderful thing.
I don't think we had any other questions, but I want to ask you before we go, do you have any advice for people who are looking to find a grief therapist? Well,
you could find Dr. Mandel if you're in California.
It's a tough question. The first thing I want to do, I want to put a plug in for an organization that I work with called Grief Haven. Their website is griefhaven.org, and they have tremendous resources for grieving people. So I just want to mention that. And people find therapists in a variety of ways. A lot of times people just start with their insurance company because they want somebody who's covered. Sometimes people go through synagogues or churches or hospitals or community mental health centers. There's a lot of different avenues. To find somebody good can be challenging.
Maybe a better question is, what does the right relationship look like in therapist and client? How do you know if you found it?
If you feel heard and understood and you have a sense from the therapist's responses that they're knowledgeable in the area and you feel like they get you, those are the fundamental feelings that you want to share more. You don't want to run screaming from the room. That you have this idea that their knowledge base, what they share with you, fits with the questions you're sitting with, and you have some discomfort that's eased.
The last question that we asked you in advance is about the timeline. And I know I've asked you this 5 billion times. When is it going to get better? When is it going to get better? Or like, can you just kind of walk me through like how much longer of this hell do I have? With the caveat that it's going to be forever. I remember the first time I asked you this, I was 3 months out and I was like, Dr. Mandel, it's been 3 months. I feel like I did it.
And I had to carefully word my answer there.
Like, I think you're still in early days.
You
said, I'll never forget what you said. You're like, that's a chunk of time.
However, I remember that very well.
That's a chunk of time.
And guess how much more is coming? No,
a whole lifetime, unfortunately. Unfortunately, but
so everyone is different. In this way, there isn't a timeline per se, but grieving is a long process, and we never fully return to who we were before the loss occurred. But that doesn't mean that there aren't really important parts of us that will emerge. I know we want to reclaim that self, but we can be a version of that self and also more. For some, the first year is hardest. For some, actually, the second year is harder because in the first year, there's a lot of shock and there's a lot of just getting through moment by moment. The second year, and I don't know what you guys are finding, but for some people, it's as if, okay, so it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and I'm running out of steam, and why isn't it ending, and how can it still be there? And I've been so strong, and I've been at it, and oh my God, I'm like stuck in this, on this hamster wheel. Often people are aware that things are much different at 3 years and at 5 years, but a lot is determined by the work that people do and how much they try to create value and meaning in the living.
Is my face like, oh my God, 5 years? I have 5 years.
But everybody's different. I'm just saying those are shifts, but that doesn't mean you're not doing an amazing job now.
But you would say 3 months is definitely not.
3 months is a chunk of time.
3 months, you're barely beginning to define what this loss is for you.
Yeah.
You're in survival.
Years.
But the big thing is that we need to create a new normal, right? Because nothing is normal about not having our child here with us. And so that's part of the task of that time is figuring out how to create that.
I will say, as you know, for a little bit of hope for our listeners who are maybe earlier in the loss, I've found the second to be easier. I felt like it was harder, which has been not easy by any stretch, but easier.
I think I have a better language to articulate what my needs are in the second. So I'm able to better help myself because I now can anticipate what the bad moments are going to look for, and I know who and how to ask for the support I need. And that, I think I wouldn't have known that last year. So
yeah, we have more tools.
I have more tools in my toolbox. A glowing review for Dr. Mandel. To all of our wonderful new friends, we want to hear from you. Email us at aslongasimlivingpodcast@gmail.com. And follow us on Instagram at aslongasimlivingpodcast. We'll get back to you as soon as our grieving brains allow.
Yay!